Box Chapter 2 covers time and change regarding public administration. The environment of public administration is somewhat broad, and most people tend to focus on the present and its circumstances and effects. However, the past greatly influences the present as well as future concerns. I should also add that one of the generational differences between millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers is the younger people are, the less concerned they are with the past and history. It's a shift and a change in society that some of us old-timers have difficulty with. Labor unions, including government unions, have historically, had a role, but they've really changed throughout time. And ironically, public service unions or government workers, those unions have actually grown, whereas in the private sector, they have shrunk. They're much less influential than what they used to be. Some predispositions and freedom of thought. Most American laws and public practices are rooted in European tradition going back 300 plus years. What influences direction, regardless of a positive or negative outcome, are the collective values of citizens, government officials at all levels, and special interest groups. In particular, special interest groups have far more influence than what our founding fathers ever imagined. Some recurring themes, just to mention a few, an important assumption of the box text is the notion that people who understand their societal and historical context are better prepared to meet the present in a realistic manner. And I may also add here that one of the challenges that we have among the very partisan nature that the United States has realized in recent years is the fact that the media influences individual thought a great deal. And I think it's probably fair to say the media is generally not as objective as it used to be. It depends on what network one prefers to watch. And so we tend to get slanted views that affect the themes and what we think about government and society. So picture a change. We now have a great deal of social fragmentation. I don't really think I need to elaborate on that. It's rather obvious. In the old days, if you will, Democrats and Republicans got along fairly well. There wasn't a great deal of difference between them. People often would go from one party to the other in terms of voting. There was not nearly as much hostility between generations and income groups, but today we're far more socially fragmented. To an extent, social media has helped that fragmentation, if you will, although I don't really want to put it in a positive light necessarily, but people are also more isolated in their communications. You know, they communicate through the computer versus face-to-face, and so folks tend to get a little more alienated from each other as far as personal contact goes. There's also skepticism about authority. And that's even in academia. Students are more skeptical of what they're getting from their professors, especially ones that have been around for a while. They prefer people closer to their own age because they feel like they can relate to them more, when that's often the case. And then we also have this paradox of globalization. Despite local preference, globalization has a tremendous impact, and that is very much different from the past, and the internet has really helped that a great deal. We're much more of a global society now than in prior times. Some historical peculiarity, early founders, the U.S., Washington, Jefferson, etc., they weren't entrenched in an urbane, sophisticated, industrial society. They were primarily rural farmers. They had slaves. And while it was controversial and some of them didn't agree with the concept, they still had slaves, and it took a while for that to change. Social and cultural differences compared to today were, are enormous, and actually these differences you can say were really large in the past and the present. You had very few people that had a college education. In fact, there was something like one half of 1% of everybody in the time of Washington and Jefferson had educations, but 40% of the authors of the Constitution and those that ratified it had college educations. So that gives you an idea of how far apart they were from mainstream society. In a peculiar way, however, the theories and writings of the past and their policies are still contemporary. And it should be mentioned that one of the conflicts in politics today, especially at the national level, is the conflict over the Constitution. In general, Republicans tend to view the Constitution as a fixed instrument that should not be changed. Democrats, especially progressive Democrats, think it should be a living, breathing document. And that's a conflict that takes root in Supreme Court appointments. Are the justices hard and fast constitutionalists, or do they believe it's a more flexible document? And we've witnessed many examples of that in recent years, examples regarding this conflict. Some historical similarity. There's concerns that our founding fathers had are still somewhat similar today, and that involves primarily balancing collective action with individual freedoms. What's good for society as a whole versus how much are we impinging on individual choice and freedom. There have been a few periods of peace and tranquility in recent years, or I should say the illusion thereof, such as the nice 1950s. Everything was great. Everybody had a job. We had Elvis and, cheerleaders and, rock and roll, and everybody's buying cars, and seems like a happy time. The show Happy Days sort of epitomized that. And maybe to a certain extent, the 70s were a little bit calm, the latter part, and portions of the 1980s. But there have been many periods of upheaval, such as today, including World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and the 1960s counterculture movement and the related civil unrest, primarily related to the Vietnam War, and earlier in the 60s, from about 1961 through about 67, 68, we had the civil rights movement, and in its early days, there were protests, marches, etc. Some change in economics. U.S. society is still concerned with individual freedom from authority and economic opportunity, and public administration exists within this norm of societal values. However, the both the means and the ends of achieving that between, let's say, the two-party system, Democrats and Republicans, does vary from time to time. They're rarely aligned regarding these concepts.